It's an alternate 1945, and the German jackboot has utterly dominated mainland Europe. Each nation of the once diverse continent has either bowed their heads in defeat, aligned directly as allies, or outright turned into colonies. With such a great success, it would be safe to assume that the Germans had achieved their Endsieg, ultimate victory. But there remains a single nation who soon has the capability to resist the Germans' titanic grip on the continent: the United Kingdom. This grim timeline diverged from our history when, after a disastrous conclusion to the Battle of Dunkirk, the British agreed to a peace deal where Germany is enabled to dominate mainland Europe and Britain keeps its empire, avoiding any meaningful land acquisitions by the Italians due to their lack of participation in that conflict. The peace that had ensured that the British would not intervene in mainland European affairs was due to be renewed this year, but the British had refused to conform with the Germans' new order, choosing instead to align with the United States of America. With the outright refusal for the British to fall in line, the Germans have to perform a show of force, lest the rest of the continent stand up to them. With the conquest of European Russia, Germany has direct access to the abundant resources of the region. But did they have enough time to properly exploit them and develop a navy strong enough to combat the British? Even if they had, would they survive a direct confrontation with the British with their American allies? How did the British and Americans become allies anyhow? And how did the war in Asia resolve? Welcome to part 2 of my collaboration with Possible History, where I finally give my take on an Axis victory scenario. This timeline is different, but similar to Thousand Week Reich, a scenario in Hearts of Iron 4 mod. If this scenario interests you, I highly recommend you check out their lore. Links will be in the description. Of course, if you missed part 1 of the video, you can watch it here. It gives extra context exactly for what's going on. Thanks again to Possible History for this amazing opportunity to collaborate. He's made an Everything Went Right for the Axis video and is currently working on a series detailing why Germany could not have won World War II. If you haven't already, please check it out. With that being said, let's catch up with Mustache Man and see how his state is doing. The Greater German Reich had now stretched from Calais to Arkhangelsk, from Amsterdam to Baku, and from Vienna to Narvik. While a significant majority of the people of this state would be colonial subjects or second-class citizens, the Germans would have an incredible amount of resources at their disposal. With such an unprecedented amount of expansion by the Germans, even their closest allies would begin to question their alignment. The first nation that would be showing signs of disobedience would be Italy. Italy had been ill prepared for war when Germany had demanded Danzig, and started what we know as the Second World War. In this timeline, due to the speed of which the conflict was resolved, there was no opportunity for the Italians to gain land off the British. Instead, Italy would only gain their claims against the French, leading to an incredible amount of resentment to the Germans for accepting the British offer of limited peace. The alliance that Italy had with Germany was not one that either the Germans or Italians had explicitly desired, as Italy had preferred an Austrian buffer state between themselves and Germany, and the Germans thought that the Italians were in general pretty low on their tier list. But due to the fact that the Germans were anticipating war with the British after the expiration of the Dunkirk Treaty, there was a chance for Italy to claim the rest of their territories. With enough preparation, as well as practical experience fighting the Soviet Union, the opportunity for the Pact of Steel to finally benefit Italy was at hand. These secret promises of war with Britain and a partitioning of Switzerland would keep the Italians in line until the anticipated conflict. But before we witness how this resolves, we must first explore the exact fate of Asia in this scenario. Asia had been in a state of war ever since the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, leading to a full-scale war between the Japanese and Chinese. The expansionist Japanese had hoped to subjugate China under their dominion before expanding their influence across the entirety of the Pacific Ocean in ambitions to create a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. In our timeline, the Japanese, Italians, and Germans had signed the Tripartite Pact on September 27, 1940. This Tripartite Pact is a solidification of the Axis powers that we know of today, where each had agreed to protect each other from foreign hostile nations. Once the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, the Germans had declared war on the Americans to respect the Tripartite Pact, which ultimately led to their defeat. Now, here's a major hot take from your Loredad. In this timeline, the Tripartite Pact is not signed. But why? Well, let me explain. In our timeline, Germany had attempted to negotiate a peace with Britain out of the capitulation of the French. After they refused, he attempted to bomb them into submission. This had only aggravated the British more, and therefore peace was not an option after that point. He had hoped to navally invade the islands, but the mighty British Navy would have destroyed any attempts. However, the British Navy were distracted somehow, say, fighting another naval power halfway across the world. Maybe then there would be a chance for Germany to destroy the British. With all these factors in mind, Germany would sign the Tripartite Pact and include Japan into the Axis. During the war with China, and after the signing of the Tripartite Pact, Japan had demanded Indochina from Vichy France. While in our timeline and this timeline there was and would be several attempts to negotiate things peacefully with the French government, the Japanese would have invaded, which resulted in their occupation eventually being recognized by Vichy France in our timeline. While it's safe to assume that a similar occurrence would happen in this timeline, I would argue that there would be no reason for the French state to give up Indochina without a fight. Neither the Germans or French would want the rubber-rich Indochina to fall into a hostile nation's grasp, nor lose their access to Chinese tungsten. So when the Japanese invade Indochina, the French state would resist Japan, rather than meekly complying with the territorial concession after the incident, like in our timeline. With the divergences already causing a significant shift in the outcome of the Asia War, it warrants further questioning. Would Japan be able to defeat the Indochinese garrison? Would Japan even consider fighting the British or bombing Pearl Harbor? To properly answer these questions, we need to discuss the exact fates of the colonial empires of the Netherlands and Belgium. After the Dunkirk peace had ensured that the Germans had annexed the Benelux, the Dutch and Belgian governments had remained in power of their colonial holdings. Despite this, the British were forbidden from recognizing their claims to their former European holdings. While there was nothing stopping the British from re-recognizing these exiled governments following the expiration of the Dunkirk peace, the problem was that these governments may not last long enough to have any meaningful effect. The Germans had hoped that with the expulsion of their colonial masters from their homelands, it would trigger significant unrest within these colonies and their neighboring regions. This would theoretically occupy their humiliated adversaries and grant Germany more time to consolidate their eastern acquisitions. This would have worked. However, this strategy's effectiveness was mitigated by the British through the League of Nations mandate system. While applying the mandate system to the Netherlands and the Belgian colonies seems like a perfect solution to the issues at hand, it's worth noting that the legitimacy of the League of Nations would at this point be extremely flimsy. While the institution of the League of Nations effectively ended its functionality after the Soviet invasion of Finland, it still technically existed until the United Nations was formed as a successor. Despite the lack of legitimacy, the British would have no other recourse but to enforce the League of Nations mandates in the Dutch regions of South America, the Belgian colony of the Congo, and the Dutch East Indies in Asia. These mandates would maintain the colonial administration of their former overlords, but would all be under the British and their purview. While this arrangement prevented significant unrest in South America and Africa, there would be no stopping the unrest of Indonesia reaching a boiling point. While the British may have attempted to prevent the Dutch East Indies from collapsing through the establishment of a League of Nations mandate, it only gave Indonesian nationalists like Sukarno the confidence to revolt for their independence. Japan would be a major supporter of Indonesia and Sukarno and would begin supporting the movement directly. When Britain would protest this action, Japan would demand that Britain stop supporting what they would call the Nanjing government. Eventually, there'd be no recourse but direct war between the Japanese and British, roughly the same time as our history. While it may be safe to assume that due to the fact that the British Navy would not need to actively prevent a naval invasion of the home isles, they would be able to divert far more naval resources against the Japanese, and would therefore win any engagement. However, the way that this war had manifested was far more problematic for the British, as the revolution of the Indonesians would trigger a Southeast Asian spring, with a significant propagandic edge towards Japan. The advent of the British facing an empire-ending threat would cause Britain to not be able to easily destroy the Japanese. However, the United States of America would still get involved in the conflict, as the Americans would still embargo the Japanese, and the Japanese would still strike Pearl Harbor in a preemptive action. Despite the significant divergences, there's no preventing Japan's fate ending similarly to how it had in our history. However, there are consequences which drastically affect the outcome of the war, that being the utter destruction of the Soviet Union. With the Soviet state effectively non-existent following the anarchy of losing their beloved leader and the annexation of all of Soviet Europe, the non-European regions of the Soviet Union would face significant unrest, only adding further to the East Asian Spring. Uprisings of Islamic fundamentalists in Central Asia would inspire the imitation revolutions in Xinjiang, which would easily fall to the insurgents as they lacked their primary benefactor, the Soviet Union. The Chinese communists, in a united front against the Japanese, would slowly diminish in influence as they lose their benefactors as well. These factors would play into the ability for the Chinese nationalists to resist Japan, and would further play into the advantages that Japan would have over their adversaries. However, Japan would ultimately be obliterated through nuclear fire. Just like in our history, Japan would have been nuked by the United States, who would have managed to develop the bomb around the same time as our history. While Cody in his video on the topic argues that the Americans would not deploy the nukes against the Japanese, I don't agree that this would be their fate. While I see the logic in the decision making, I also think that the Americans would have deployed their bombs in order to guarantee their victory and not risk far more American lives in a naval invasion. That, and the American forces would be required elsewhere, as they would need to help the British stabilize their insurgencies. Just like our history, Japan would surrender, and the victorious powers would establish an occupation. However, what's worth noting is that France would technically be a victorious power against the Japanese alongside China, Britain, and the United States. This camaraderie against their mutual enemy, despite their heavy German influence, would provide the West an opportunity to begin influencing the French state through mutual trade and other treaties. This attempt to pull France out of the abusive relationship that they shared with the Germans would lay the seeds for yet another German invasion. However, after the Germans hear word of the Americans' Wunderwaffen, their foreign policy would radically shift. Their motivations to rapidly construct a navy for an offensive strike against the British would pivot to a purely defensive measure until the Germans can discover the secrets of the nuclear bomb. While it's very commonly understood in the alternate history space that the Germans were not close to achieving the nuclear bomb due to their ideology and the time frame, I would argue that in this scenario, where Germany would need to quickly develop the nuclear bomb in their self-defense, there's the potential that they could eventually manage to obtain one. The question, however, is would they be able to keep their economy afloat long enough to obtain this nuclear deterrence? The German economy was always on the brink of collapse, with looting and conquest being their primary means of maintaining itself. Without this scheduled British invasion, the Germans lacked the capability to continue to sustain itself. Something had to give. Either the ideological aspect of autarky would need to be abandoned, or the Germans would need to go to war despite the nuclear threat. In Cody's timeline, due to the lack of intelligence confirming the existence of a nuclear bomb, or going to war despite it, the Germans chose war and attempted to invade Britain. In my timeline, I will instead have it be that Germany attempts to step away from autarky and begins attempting to establish friendly relations with other nations. This radical shift of policy may lead to their destruction. However, it's the only move that Germany could make. Thus, Mustache Man would arrive in Switzerland not as a conqueror, but a diplomat, seeking to normalize relations with the remaining nations of the world. The sudden shift of policy of the Germans would be seen by the world as pathetic. Yet at the same time, the Western nations of the world could not afford to doubt German strength. In this timeline, the only truth that the Western world has seen is that Germany has, despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, managed to humiliate the victors of the Great War within months and succeeded in an invasion of Russia far beyond Napoleon could have ever hoped for. But while the Germans may be strong, they aren't nuclear capable. The USA has shown to their allies that they've developed a weapon so powerful that nearly entire cities can be decimated with a single strike. And yet, I believe the Americans could not afford to deploy them against Germany. Any violent action taken by the Americans and their allies at this point would only legitimize German fashionista claims of the true nature of the American government. Even if vehemently untrue, the sheer propagandic effect of this action could lead to unthinkable reactions to the Western world. While in our timeline, the little fashion trend that Europe had gone through for a decade or two would vanish after the rest of the world had shamed them for their terrible style, in this timeline, German and Italian fashion would be far more popular in the rest of the world. And instead of being humiliated, and the terrible, horrible things that I cannot repeat on this wonderful platform known as YouTube, even with the ridiculous way of sidestepping, would never be fully known to the West, as compared to our timeline. So, in my opinion, there is no recourse for the West beyond agreeing to meeting with Germany in order to attempt to create a successor to the League of Nations. However, by deciding to play diplomacy rather than outright conflict, Germany had once again betrayed their obligations to the Italians, leaving the regime of Yes Man in shambles. Mustache Man had promised Yes Man that the Swiss state would be partitioned. Now, instead of arriving as a conqueror, Mustache Man had arrived pleading and begging for peace. The secret promises of Mustache Man to Yes Man were once again broken, and now the nationalists of Italy would turn on Yes Man. The most vocal advocate against German alignment, No Man, would begin to mobilize a faction of disgruntled fashionistas to depose Yes Man with the support of the Italian monarchy. What should have been a clean-cut coup d'etat had manifested into a civil war, where Yes Man had escaped to the north to declare a rival government, the Italian Social Republic. The establishment of the ISR in this timeline is very similar to our timeline, but the difference in this timeline is that the Italian Empire and their influenced states would have the opportunity to declare independence and break away from the Germans' new order. Italian East Africa would begin to suffer extreme unrest. The Albanian and Greek protectorates would collapse, granting these states independence. With this direct threat to the German sphere of influence, the soft underbelly of Europe would need to be protected. Germany would recognize Yes Man's Social Republic as the true government of Italy, in exchange for heavy territorial concessions following the old borders of Austria. Will the Italian Social Republic or the Italian Empire unite Italy? Or will a ceasefire between the two rival governments be made in order to keep the peace between the Germans and Americans? Would the Germans manage to maintain their economy during the transition away from full autarky? Would China move closer to the Americans? Or would the Germans manage to reach out to the Chinese? What successor state would rise from the ashes of the collapse of the Soviet Union in Siberia? All of these questions and more could be answered in a future series, Project Germania. If you're interested in me exploring this timeline more, or if you have any ideas or feedback, please let me know in the comments. Thank you again to Possible History for your help in developing this timeline, and for the opportunity to collaborate. If you haven't already, please check out his videos on the topic. Shout out to Enzo Rafael Souza Silva, Louis Avant, Grud, Jubs, and Solo Leo for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. General tip of advice, European fashion in this era it's out of style. It's like 90 years. People are still trying to wear it. Dude, it's really cringe. Consider more modern fashion. But I hope you have a good day.